This is the Solid Signal Podcast for the week of May 13th, 2019. And the subject of this week's podcast is what everybody's talking about, at least on the Monday while I'm recording this. What happens when a show that you've been following for close to a decade goes dangerously off the rails in its last couple of episodes? Now, I'm not saying that I believe that about AT&T and HBO's Game of Thrones. I'm saying that a lot of other folks do. I honestly think that if you look at the episode in the context of the history of it, the characters acted in a way that was largely consistent with who they have always been, just not who we wanted them to be. But let's leave the review aside and let's talk about this in a much more generic kind of sense. As long as there has been long-form television, there have been endings. And as long as there have been endings, there have been satisfying ones and unsatisfying ones. Some of them, what comes to mind is the ending of Star Trek The Next Generation, are generally satisfying, full of happy moments, sad moments, fan service, that sort of thing. And some of them, and I'm thinking of the ending of the 1980s television show St. Elsewhere, are so deeply unsatisfying that it ruins the show forever. Unfortunately, there are more of those than there are satisfying endings. For every MASH, which ends in hugs and tears and all the things that you really want, there's a Lost where the entire last season of that show was such a train wreck that nobody really even talks about it anymore. The show is just permanently ruined. I'll say the same thing about Battlestar Galactica, which had a last episode so profoundly unlikable that people really just gave up on talking about the show forever after that, even though it had been parlor discussion among geeks for years. Now, I'm not about to talk about whether Game of Thrones is in that same company, because that's up to you. But I'd like to talk about why this sort of thing happens and whether or not it kind of should happen. And I do have a very firm opinion on this. I think that when shows end in a way that really displeases the fans, a lot of times it's because the fans themselves really were injecting something into the show that really wasn't there. Other times it's because the filmmakers themselves want to do something different. They're under pressure to feel like the ending is not simply conventional or not simply fan service. You can see this, for example, with the ending of The Sopranos, which is still talked about because it's innovative and interesting, but deeply, deeply unsatisfying for a lot of folks. So when a show does end, obviously there are a lot of different decisions that need to be made. In most shows do not necessarily start out with the idea of a beginning, a middle, and an ending. And when the ending starts to come, it has to feel by nature a little bit artificial, because what you've come to really understand about this show, the way the show feels to you, is just sort of episodic. It just goes on and on and on and on forever. And that is what you like about it a lot of the times. All of a sudden, the final episode or the final season even has to deal with closing down a lot of things that were really never meant to be closed down. They were just meant to go on and on and on forever. And that's why a lot of times it's deeply unsatisfying. But I think of this show, and I think in the context of actually a very similar kind of concept. I'll talk about the Stephen King's Dark Tower series, which was a sprawling epic that started before Game of Thrones, the book series, and went on for 20 years and encompassed this huge amount of stuff, and then ended so poorly that I personally have not picked up a Stephen King book since. You have to ask yourself, who really owns the characters? Now, I'm not talking about in terms of copyright, because that part's very clear. But when you have an author who has created the characters, do the characters really belong to that author to the extent that you can do whatever you want with them if you're the author? Or does the author owe something to the people who have read the books, watched the TV shows or the movies, and who really want to see something satisfying to them? I would argue that it's actually the latter. And I know a lot of artistic people would say, no, that's not true, that your creation is still your creation no matter what. I disagree. I think that anytime you have a hugely, hugely popular franchise, whether it's a book series or a TV series or a movie series, it is the fans who make that successful. It's the fans who have brought you all of your acclaim, all of your money, and to some extent, the fans have a right to feel like they deserve some satisfaction. Oh, I mean, I'm not saying anybody should sue because they didn't like the ending of Game of Thrones, but on the other hand, why would you intentionally sort of alienate your legacy by taking characters in this way that doesn't really satisfy the fans? And if you haven't satisfied the fans, in the case of, and I'll say Game of Thrones specifically, are you dissatisfying the fans? Are you making the fans upset because you, as a filmmaker, have not really adequately prepared them, not really adequately shown the direction that you want these characters to go in? And I know a lot of people are saying that about the recent episode of Game of Thrones, that there wasn't enough done to really prepare you for where it was going to go, to make you feel like you're inside these people's heads and they're going in a way which is logically consistent with who they are. So, I don't know. I will say this. I think that it would have been impossible to please everybody who was a fan of Game of Thrones before all of this started, and who would hopefully continue to be a fan of Game of Thrones after it's ended. I think that it is the easier thing to do would be to just succumb to all sorts of fan service and give everybody exactly what they wanted. And that would, in the case of Game of Thrones, would really belie the extreme complexity and depth that this show has always had. And so I think in a lot of ways that would be unsatisfying. But here we are with one episode left. And a lot of people are talking about never really wanting to see the show again, and how it's just turned on them in the last season. So I feel like we are somewhere in the middle on all of this. I think that realistically what we're talking about is perhaps some of the episodes have been a little bit rushed. We haven't really seen some of the internal motivations that would have made people feel like things were going in a particular direction. Instead, people have just kind of put their own spin, their own feeling on stuff. And one article I read said that you have to feel especially bad for anybody who's named their child Daenerys. And I don't want to say why because of spoilers and stuff. But if you've gone ahead and named your child Daenerys because you thought that you wanted them to be like the character and like the way that you perceived the character, that you really, you might have a reason to rethink that. And unfortunately, you've named a human being that. And what are you going to do about that? I don't know. Hard for me to say. But I will say that in the end, when it comes right down to it, that I think you just, if you are making this a TV show, a movie, a book, and it does become hugely popular, I do think that you share that character, you share the life and the pop culture that character is created with all of the people who have been enjoying it. And I think that you are doing a disservice to those people if you don't at least consider that, if you don't at least take them, not where they want to go, but at least give them an idea, much more fleshed out way of understanding where you were always trying to go in the first place. And if you didn't have that kind of plan, then I would say it comes down to your fault as a creative. And I know that's kind of harsh, but I'm sorry that's how I feel. And especially, as I said, Stephen King, to me, was a favorite author for years and years and years and years. After I finished The Dark Tower, I have never read another Stephen King book ever again, or seen any of the myriad television shows or movies or whatever, because I think that he did not understand, and explicitly even went out of his way to alienate people who thought they had some ownership of the character and deny them ownership of the pop culture phenomenon of the characters. That's the wrong way to go. I think that you always have to have a conversation with your fans. You always have to be aware of what they want and what they need. You don't always have to honor it, but in some way you do have to honor them. Anyway, I've rambled on for a while, and I would be kind of curious to see what people think. Leave a comment somewhere, anywhere that you listen to this podcast. Leave a comment, and let's get talking to it. Because there's one episode left. Either people are going to love it or hate it. Either they're going to feel like it's a good way to have spent 8 years of their time, or they're going to find out that, Bran is actually an autistic child looking at a snow globe, and that every other person that he's encountered is just one of his parents' friends. If you don't know what I'm talking about, Google Ending of St. Elsewhere. In the meantime, have a great week.